Welcome again to The Savage Truth. I'm your host, Absolute Katy. Thank you for joining me on my show where I talk about politics, media, truth, and perception.
Wir sorgen uns euch, weil wir der Überzeugung sind, dass die Bande dieser Volksgemeinschaft sich niemals und nirgends lösen. Wir grüßen Sie, mein Führer, mit unserem alten Kampfruf. Adolf Hitler, sieg heil! Sieg heil! Sieg heil!
Propaganda. What you just heard was a speech by Adolf Hitler from 1937 and from his chief propagandist Joseph Goebbels from 1934. I know that is a really weird record for me to have. I came by it many years ago when a friend was getting rid of a pile of vinyls, and I kept it because I thought it just seemed really intriguing and kind of dangerous. I didn't even listen to it for years because I thought that even though I don't speak German and couldn't understand it, that just listening to it would poison my mind and I would turn into some hateful Nazi. But what I should have realized then is that the big danger isn't the propaganda that we know about. It's the subtle, manipulative messages that we hear every day that we don't realize are shaping our opinions. That's the real danger. So what do I mean? Well, according to Wikipedia, propaganda is information that is not objective and is used primarily to influence an audience and further an agenda, often by presenting facts selectively to encourage a particular perception or using loaded language to produce an emotional rather than rational response. To understand this more fully, let's take a look at the guy who wrote the book on propaganda, Austrian-American named Edward Bernays. No, really, he wrote the book on propaganda. It's called Propaganda. The book that he wrote in 1928 drew heavily on the idea of unconscious desires, an idea that was put forth by somebody you may have heard of, Edward Bernays' uncle, Sigmund Freud. Bernays postulated that if you directed messages to these unconscious desires, that people could be manipulated en masse. In fact, Bernays saw this manipulation of the American public as a benefit. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind. While Bernays was seeking to explore the commercial value of his ideas in America through advertising, his books were also being studied across the globe, in Germany, by none other than Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels' role at the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda was to centralize Nazi control over all aspects of German cultural and intellectual life. Now, just think about the name of that organization, Ministry of Public Enlightenment, whose sole purpose was to push forth an agenda of the Nazi government. I want to point this out because the names of organizations don't always match what their intended purpose is, and that's not by accident. Much of Goebbels' propaganda centered around portraying Hitler himself and Germany as a whole as supremely heroic and infallible.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
This propaganda film from Leni Riefenstahl called Triumph of the Will. It was carefully choreographed and edited to make Adolf Hitler appear like a strong leader and to make support of him seem universal. And this was carefully constructed with Goebbels and their propaganda arm working hand in hand with the filmmaker. Or that Hitler was great with children, that Germans were strong and superior, that idealistic young girls cared about the Nazi cause, that Germany was a victim or potential victim of outside forces, and who was behind those forces that Germany could punish. But films and posters alone weren't what ultimately sold the German public on the slow march toward the Holocaust, where millions of their friends and neighbors were rounded up for slaughter. The most important component of the propaganda effort by Nazi Germany was the control of the news media. Goebbels' office controlled every aspect of the press, which painted German aggression as justified and defensive. Newsreels, which were produced all over Europe as part of the propaganda campaign, were overseen by Goebbels personally. He was part of the editing process in order to ensure that the messaging was exactly right for what they wanted to present to the public. Now, I think about what it must have been like to be a German citizen at that time. If every source of information available to you was saying the same thing, that Germany was being threatened by outside forces, that Jews were responsible for those threats, and that everyone universally supports your leader, it's not hard to imagine how difficult it must have been to resist those messages or to think of anything different. Which brings us to today. Or rather, let's take a step back to 2005, when federal auditors found that George W. Bush and his administration were breaking the law by buying favorable news coverage and also paying to have news-like reels produced and distributed across the nation as if it was organic news.
When President Bush signed the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act into law last month, millions of people who are covered by Medicare began asking how it will help them.
This is going to be the same Medicare system, only with new benefits.
Now that video seems pretty benign now, but it was in fact government propaganda intended to deceive the public into thinking that this was an independent news reporter discussing this issue that the government wanted you to think a certain way about. And considering the lies that were put forth concerning weapons of mass destruction in order to get us into the Iraq war, that video that we know about is really just the tip of the iceberg. So if Bush was caught red-handed promoting propaganda, can you imagine if there weren't any laws in place to prevent that kind of thing? Oh, wait. We don't have to imagine, because Obama in 2012 repealed critical components of the Smith-Mundt Act, which up until that point made it illegal for the government to produce propaganda against its own citizens. Thanks, Obama! That repeal unleashed thousands of hours per week of U.S. government-funded radio and TV programming, also known as propaganda, against the U.S. public. And it's all completely legal for them to do so. Thanks, Obama! So it's now been 6 years since that happened. And with our government leaders and media telling us every day that foreign enemies are coming to get us, that our own neighbors could be working for those enemies, that our American cause is righteous, heroic, maybe even infallible. Can we really trust those messages? Or are we being led, as Edward Bernays predicted, by men whose names we do not know, who are pulling the wires that control the public mind? I'll let you form your own conclusions. But do not think for a minute that the kind of mass public coercion that happened in Nazi Germany could not happen again. That was my show. Thank you again for joining me on The Savage Truth. Once again, I'm your host, Absolute Katy. Find me on Twitter at Absolute Katy and on Steemit and Gab at Absolute Katy as well. And please subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think. And always think for yourself.